Good morning, grade 10S. I hope you guys are all doing well. Today we are going to be learning about Rocky Shore ecosystems. So this is going to be a continuation from where we would have stopped last class. And at the end of this lesson, you will find an assignment on Google Classroom for you guys to complete. All right, so we can begin. All right, so by time as this video is finished, we will learn about the different abiotic and biotic factors that you find on a rocky shore ecosystem. We'll learn about where you find these rocky shore ecosystems, or which part of the island that you would expect to see them in. We'll learn about the different zones inside a rocky shore ecosystem. And then we will also learn about, I guess, the different organisms that you find, the importance of this ecosystem, and how energy is going to flow through this ecosystem, as well as some of the adaptations of some of the organisms that live in this ecosystem and how those adaptations are going to help those organisms to survive. All right, so we would have covered this part in our last class, about what a rocky shore basically is. But as the name implies, a rocky shore, it's just basically a part of uh, I guess, of the shore that has a lot of rocks that's going to be right next to the beach. Okay, so usually when we think about the beach, we think of, I guess, seeing something that has sand, but obviously not all shores or not all of the land that you always find next to the ocean is going to be filled with sand. Okay, sometimes you have a sandy shore, which is a different type of ecosystem. And then other times you have a rocky shore, which is what we'll be talking about today. Now, with a rocky shore ecosystem, you typically find these ecosystems on the windward side of the island. Okay, and what that basically means is this is the part of the island that is exposed to more wind. Okay, and because you have so much wind, no sand can really accumulate in this area, and that basically exposes all of the I guess the bedrock and all of the limestone rocks that you can see right here in this picture. Okay, so that's what's going to cause that, and that's why I guess you find so much rocks inside this area because there's so much exposure to wind. Now, because of the, I guess, the abiotic factors that you find on this ecosystem, you will find that only a certain amount of organisms that you will actually find inside this ecosystem. Okay, so for example, you tend to find a lot of different invertebrates, such as mollusks, for example, on this type of ecosystem. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the abiotic factors that you will find on a rocky shore. Okay, so one of the first things I guess we'll talk about is that I guess you have the changing tides that's going to affect this habitat. Okay, because it's a shore, you literally find it right next to the water, and that means that at certain times of the day, the tide is going to be low, which would mean that these rocks that these animals live on is going to be exposed to the air as well as direct sunlight. And then in other times of the day, you might have high tide. Okay, so whenever there's high tide, obviously the water is going to be higher. Uh, the majority of this land is going to be covered, as you can see in this picture right here. And that basically allows some of those organisms to, once again be covered by water. So that's going to help to, I guess, keep them cooler, protect them from the sunlight. And that's going to help to bring their temperature down. Okay. And temperature, that's going to be another abiotic factor that we'll, I guess, mention a little bit later. Okay, so I guess you could see that happening inside these two pictures. To the top here, you have low tide. Okay, so imagine all of the different mollusks that you might find on this ecosystem, such as sea snails and whelks and curbs, different stuff like that. So whenever it's low tide, they're going to be exposed to sunlight. And then over here, you have high tide, which means that all those different mollusks, a lot of them are going to now be covered by the water. Okay, another unique thing about a rocky shore is that you would find that the conditions on a rocky shore is very variable. Okay, so you may have parts that are, underwater. You may have parts that, I guess, receive some type of moisture whenever the waves crash into it. And you may have parts that are always, or I guess usually on land and always exposed to the air as well as sunlight. Okay, and you could also see that inside this picture here. But once we start to talk about the different zones that you find on the rocky shore, I guess we'll elaborate on that a little bit more. Okay, so some of the other abiotic factors besides, changing tides and having a lot of wave action, because, like I said, this is right next to the shore. Okay, so you'll always have water coming in and out, whether it's high tide or low tide. Okay, so another abiotic factor is that you will have changing salt levels inside the water. Okay, and what's basically going to cause this is that sometimes on a rocky shore, you will find these areas called tidal pools. Okay, and basically what causes, these tidal pools, it's just a collection of a small body of water. All right, so on a rocky shore, it's literally just a bunch of rocks that are going to experience some kind of erosion, either from the water or from wind. Okay, so what that causes is these little pools to form inside of the rock. Okay, so inside those pools, uh, you'll have a little body of water. And because that water is exposed to sunlight, what happens eventually is that that sunlight is going to evaporate that water. And as that water evaporates, that causes that little tidal pool to be a little bit more salty. Okay, so that's why this is also a abiotic factor. You're gonna have change in salt levels or change in salinity. Okay, but once again, once we get to the part when we talk about zonations or the different zones on the rocky shore, I'll revisit that same point to elaborate on that again. All right, and next for the abiotic factors, you have temperature. Okay, so one of the reasons why this temperature is always going to be constantly changing is because remember, at some parts of the day, you're going to have high tide, which means that, all of those creatures are going to be covered by cool water, and that is going to, keep them cool as well as to take them directly out of sunlight. Okay, so that's going to, cool down their body. And that's going to happen, during the high tide. Now, the opposite will happen when you have low tide, okay? Because, for example, in this picture to the top here, once the water goes back, or once, there's low tide, imagine that you have, a bunch of different, mollusks like clams and oysters and, periwinkles. Now they're going to be exposed directly to the sun. Okay, and that sunlight, that's going to increase their temperature. All right, so that's why, the temperature is going to vary from, different parts of the day. Okay, and in addition to that, you also have change in seasons. At some point of the year, it's going to be summer. Naturally, it's going to be warmer. And, whenever it's winter, naturally, it's also going to be a little bit more cooler. Okay, so those are some of the abiotic factors that you find on a rocky shore. All right. Some of the other abiotic factors, but I guess I would have mentioned some of this before. Okay, because remember, whenever we talk about abiotic factors, these are just basically the non-living elements that are going to affect an ecosystem. Okay, so for example, I would have mentioned wind before, because you find rocky shores on the windward part of an island. This is the part of the island that's going to be exposed through the majority of wind. Okay, then you also have light intensity. Okay, because obviously you have the sun, and that's also going to play a role in affecting, temperature. All right, and you also have the substrate, okay, which is just basically, the rocks that you find inside this ecosystem, which is basically, I guess, the most defining feature of this ecosystem because we call it a rocky shore ecosystem. Okay, so a substrate, that's just basically, I guess, the ground of this ecosystem. All right, so now we're going to talk about the four different zones when it comes to a rocky shore. All right, so yeah, here are the four zones right here. You have the splash zone, you have the intermittently wet zone, you have the tide, the same tidal pools I was telling you about, uh, and then you have the permanently wet zone. Okay, so just from looking at this picture here, you can kind of see the majority of these zones right here. Okay, so for example, let's start from the bottom where you have permanently wet zone. So this is basically going to be the part of the rocky shore that is always covered by water. Okay, so that means basically this is where water is going to be covering even when there's a low tide. Okay, so if if this if these rocks are covered during the low tide, then that basically means they are always going to be covered by water. Because yeah, that's why we call it the permanently wet zone. So whether it's high tide or low tide, this part of the rocky shore here, that is always going to be covered by water. Okay, next you will have the tidal pools. Okay, so you might not necessarily be able to see it that well in this picture, but you can kind of see how you have these little, uh, I guess, holes or these little pits that you find inside the bedrock or the substrate or these rocks right here. So these little pits right here, what they're going to do is basically collect water. Okay, so yeah, that's another common thing that you find on a rocky shore. Okay, so whenever you go to any kind of rocky shore beach, you will always notice that in some of those holes, you could see a little bit of water. You might see, tiny little fishes or I guess mollusks or what's not swimming inside of that water. Okay, so that's what these tide pools are right here. Because it's a rocky shore, you're gonna have erosion, and that's going to cause these little holes or these little pits to form inside the rock. And these are basically places where water can be collected. All right, next we have the intermittently wet zone. Okay, so from looking at this picture here, that would probably be this area right here. Okay, and what the intermittently wet zone basically is, that just basically means that, at parts of the day, it's going to be covered by water, and other parts of the day, it's going to be exposed to the air. And what's basically causing that is because, the tides are going to change. Okay, during a part of the day, you're going to have high tide. Okay, during high tide, this area is probably going to be covered by water. And then you're also going to have low tide, which would mean that this area is not going to be completely covered by water. Okay, so during that part of the day, it's going to be exposed to the air. Okay, and once you move past the intermittently wet zone, you will have the splash zone. Okay, and the reason why we call it the splash zone is because I guess during parts of the day when the tide is a little bit higher, and whenever you have, the waves crashing in, you still have some water moisture, I guess, splashing away from those waves and keeping, a certain region of this rocky shore moist with water. So that's why we call it the splash zone. Okay, the only water that reaches the splash zone, which I would say is probably, say like right here, the only water that's ever going to reach it is whenever it's high tide and, the waves are crashing in, and that's going to cause that water to splash on this zone right here. So that's how, the organisms that live here are going to receive whatever moisture they can. All right. Here's another picture that basically shows these different zones. Okay, and like I said, with the permanently wet zone, even when it's low tide, it's going to be covered by water. With the intermittently wet zone, whenever the tide changes, for example, if it's high tide, it's going to be covered by water. Whenever it's low tide, it's not going to be covered by water. Okay, this right here also shows a tide pool. Okay, which I said, it's basically going to be a little pit inside this rock, and this is going to collect water. And then past the intermittently wet zone, you're gonna have the splash zone. Okay, so this only receives water whenever the waves crash in, and you have the water basically splashing on this area right here. Okay, so now we're gonna take a closer look at the splash zone. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I guess I already described this to you guys. So this right here is just showing pictures of how this area is going to look. Like I said, uh, in this bottom picture here, you could kind of see, it's high tide, and you could see this water or these waves are basically crashing in. And whenever they crash in, that is going to spray some water into this area. So that's how this area is going to receive its moisture. Now, when it comes to the organisms that you will find living inside this area here, you'll find some invertebrates, you'll find birds, as well as you'll find some algae, which would be the plants that you find living inside this area. Okay, because whenever it comes to algae, as long as there's some kind of moisture in a particular, I guess, area on this ecosystem, that's going to provide them with what they, I guess, the conditions it needs to grow. Okay, so whenever you find moisture on these rocks, that's where you're going to find these algae growing. Okay, and in addition to that, let's see. Yeah, you tend to find, a lot of jagged rocks here. Okay, reason being is because, you have a bunch of erosion from whenever you have these waves crashing in and spraying water. So that's going to cause erosion. That's going to, break down some of this limestone rocks, and that's going to, cause that jaggedness that you see here in this picture. All right. Okay, what else is notable about the splash zone? I mean, obviously, this is going to be the driest part of the rocky shore. Okay, because literally the only water that this area ever gets is either, I guess, when it rains or, from the water that splashes from these waves. Okay, so typically, this is going to be the most driest area on the Rocky Shore ecosystem. And this is also the furthest zone inside the Rocky Shore ecosystem. All right, so yeah, like I said, these are some examples of some of the organisms that you'll find inside the splash zone. This picture here basically shows periwinkles. These are also periwinkles over here. So yeah, that's you'll find some of these mollusks that lives in this area. You have some plants. Uh, to the bottom here, you have a casuarina tree. And this right here, over here, I think this is called an oxeye leaf or an oxeye rose. Okay, but yeah, this is the part of the beach where I guess you'll find more trees and different stuff like that stand to grow. Because remember I said this is the furthest part or the furthest part out from the, I guess, the ocean. Okay, so this is the furthest part from the ocean. You're kind of transitioning onto land at this point, where you'll basically find trees and different stuff like that. So you're a little ways off from the coast where you will actually find the water. So this is where you'll start to see different vegetations and stuff like that growing. Okay, and like I said as well, you'll find these same periwinkles here uh, living inside this area. Okay, now what else? Okay, so now this picture here basically shows a tidal pool or a tide pool. And like I said, what basically causes this is that because you have so much erosion inside this area, that is going to create these little pits. And wherever you have these pits, that is going to collect water. Okay, so you will find a number of organisms living inside this water. You'll once again find, things like periwinkles. Sometimes you find sea urchins. Sometimes you find starfish, as well as sea cucumbers. Okay, so those are some of the things that you might find living inside a tidal pool area. All right, so yeah, when it comes to this tidal pool area, it's mainly going to receive water even when there's high tide, and that's going to bring in, more water. Or whenever it rains, this is also going to collect some water. One of the points that I would have mentioned earlier inside the video was that on a rocky shore ecosystem, you tend to have a change in salinity or, change in levels of salt. Reason being is because, this body of water here, it's usually going to come from the seawater. That means it has salt inside of it. And whenever, the sun is going to evaporate some of this water from this same little pool, that's going to leave behind a higher concentration of salt. Okay. One of the ways that people actually, make salt or extract salt is that they let seawater evaporate and that leaves behind salt crystals. Okay. So, uh, depending on, I guess, how far this tidal pool is from the shore, uh, or the part of the day it is, say if it's low tide, for example, you're constantly going to have the sun out that's constantly going to be evaporating this water. So whenever that happens, that's going to make this water more and more salty until eventually you have the next high tide that's going to bring in more fresh seawater. Okay, so depending on the time of the day, you will have varying levels of salt inside the water. Okay, and like I said, yeah, these are some of the organisms that you find living inside a a tidal pool area. Okay, so right over here you see the sea urchins. This right here, sometimes you see these little fishes that swim inside this water, and then once again we have periwinkles over here. Now with these periwinkles, you typically find these all over the rocky shore ecosystem. So they are very, very well adapted to living inside this environment. So you find these living as far as the splash zone, as well as inside, these tidal pools right here. So you literally find them just about everywhere on this rocky shore ecosystem. All right, intimately wet zone. Uh, like I said, this is basically the area that's inside the tidal zone, basically. So this is the part where, you know, that's going to be covered whenever there's a high tide, and that's going to be exposed whenever there's a low tide. Okay, so that's basically what the intermittently wet zone basically means, or that's what it basically is. Okay, now some of the organisms that you find here, well, I'll show you that in the next slide. But basically, the organisms that you find inside this area, they're gonna have certain adaptations that helps to, protect them from the sunlight, whenever there's a low tide. So, sometimes you find a lot of these organisms, they're gonna have shells, okay? Because whenever there's direct sunlight, that shell is gonna help to keep them a little bit cool, as well as it provides some level of protection from predators and different stuff like that. All right, so here are some of the organisms that you find inside this area. And like I said, the majority, all of these organisms that's being shown here, all of them have shells. Reason being is because whenever there's low tide, they're going to be exposed directly to sunlight. That's going to make them very hot. So they need these different things that's going to help to keep their body a little bit cool. Okay. And the next thing these shells are going to help with, it's also going to prevent them from drying out or becoming dehydrated because, at parts of the day, they won't be able to be inside the water. Okay. And because of that, they are at risk of drying out. So that's why they need these shells. That's going to help to trap some of that moisture inside of their body. Okay. So, uh, this picture here shows something called nerites. Okay. Over here, you have this right here is called a curb. Okay. And this right here, you have whelks. Okay. So, yeah, these are two of the easier ones to remember, especially the curb one, because, some people eat curb salad. Some people also make whelk salad. Okay. So, yeah, this is what you're basically going to find in the intermittently wet zone. Okay, and over here you have something called a limpet. Okay, so like I said, you basically find shelled organisms living inside this zone here. Reason why they need that shell, it's going to protect them from sunlight, as well as it's going to prevent them from drying out, and it also gives them some kind of protection from predators. Okay, so you'll find that whenever it comes to an organism having some kind of adaptation or some kind of feature, these different features these animals have, they are always there to offer some kind of advantage to living inside that particular ecosystem. Okay, next we have the permanently wet zone. Okay, and this zone is basically always going to be covered by water. Okay, so this is basically the part that's covered by water whenever you have low tide. Now, yeah, when it comes to this zone here, well, I have some points here already that you can see. You're going to find a greater diversity of organisms here. You have constant wave action because, they're literally living inside the water. And you also have more predators that are going to be inside this environment. Okay, because like I said, this area is always covered by water. So there always are going to be at risk to, certain predators. Now, when it would have come to these other zones that we were talking about, because some of these organisms, they could literally live on land, that provides them with some, protection, okay, at least from the predators that you would find inside the water. Okay, so with these periwinkles, for example, because they're on land, they're pretty safe. Okay, same thing with these sea urchins. they're inside these tide pools. Okay, so they don't really have to worry about, that many predators on land. Okay, they may be in danger once again. I guess whenever there's high tide, if these tidal pools are covered by water, but generally speaking, they're going to be a little bit more safe from certain predators. But in the permanently wet zone, the organisms that live here, they don't have that, uh, I guess, that extra layer of protection. They're always going to be exposed by some kind of to some kind of predator. All right, so some of the organisms you find living inside this area, you have different type of algae that you'll find inside this area, as well as some corals and different stuff like that that you'll find in this area. Okay, you have sponge, you have sea cucumbers, you have sea anemones. Okay, so those are some of the things that you will find on this part of the ecosystem. But like I would have said, the permanently wet zone, this is where you're going to find I guess, the majority of the species that live here. So you're going to find a great diversity of organisms that live here. So you have algae, you have coral, you have sponges, you have sea urchins, sea cucumbers, sea stars. This right here, this is a sea biscuit. You'll also find something called a sand dollar. I think we call this a sand dollar over here in the Bahamas. Okay. Now, with this slide here, this just basically shows, the majority of all the adaptations that you find on this ecosystem. Uh, we were already talked about how a lot of these organisms, they have, shells and different stuff like that to protect them. So yeah, that's a very, very common adaptation that you find on this ecosystem. If they don't have some kind of, hard, I mean, generally speaking, they're gonna have some kind of exoskeleton. Okay, you see that with the starfish, for example. Okay, a lot of them have a hard shell-like exoskeleton. With some of these mollusks, like a barnacle, as well as this limpet right here and this mussel, obviously they're going to have shells, and that's going to, you know, offer some kind of advantage inside this ecosystem. With a shell, for example, like I would have said before, that's going to protect them from sunlight. That's going to protect them from certain predators. That's going to help them to conserve some water by preventing them from being dried out. Okay, so once these mollusks are inside these shells, that's going to help to contain some of that moisture. Okay, so I will stop the video there for today. And like I said, I'm going to post an assignment on Google Classroom for you guys to complete. And once I see you guys again, I guess we'll briefly discuss some of the reasons why rocky shores are important, as well as some of the threats uh, that I guess rocky shores are faced with. All right, so that'll be it for today. I'll see you guys next week.